What if the last king of the ancient world didn't die in battle, wasn't buried in a tomb, and didn't quietly grow old but was erased by the planet itself, not over a year or a lifetime, but during a 13,000-year chain reaction that almost wiped out humanity entirely? Right now, under museums in London and Baghdad, in quiet, climate-controlled rooms where the air feels older than language, clay tablets sleep on shelves, rows and rows of baked mud lined up like little bricks of frozen time. On their surfaces, wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay more than 4,000 years ago. The hands that made them are dust. The cities they describe are ruins. But the words? The words are still here, and they're all circling one question we've never really answered. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're into stories that live in the space between myth and geology, between ancient memory and planetary disaster. And if you're still here, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I like to imagine this question moving across time zones, a chain of people lying awake in the dark, thinking about the same thing. Because this story doesn't start with kings. It starts with a gap. In the late 19th century, archaeologists working near the ruins of ancient Nippur in southern Iraq started uncovering thousands of clay fragments. They were scattered everywhere, like someone had taken a history book and smashed it on the ground, page by page. When those fragments were cleaned, dried, and slowly pieced together, a pattern appeared. It wasn't a hymn, it wasn't a myth, it wasn't a spell, it was a list, the Sumerian king list. At first glance, it looked simple enough. A record of rulers, their cities, and how long they reigned. The kind of thing you'd expect from a civilization obsessed with order and record keeping. But then the numbers showed up. One king ruled for 28,800 years. The next, 36,000 years. Another, 43,200 years. These weren't rounded, symbolic, once upon a time, numbers. They were written in the same dry, bureaucratic tone as tax records and grain inventories. No poetry, no metaphors, just name, city, length of reign, as if 36,000 years was a perfectly reasonable thing to write down. And then, mid-list, everything snaps. Then the flood swept over. Oh, after that line, the entire scale of reality collapses. The kings that follow rule for hundreds of years, then tens, and eventually for lifetimes you could count with fingers and birthdays. The cosmic timescales vanish. The impossible dissolves into the ordinary. But the text never explains why. It doesn't say, and here the world changed because... It just drops that line. Then the flood swept over like a wall between two universes. For more than a century, scholars have tried to make sense of that wall. Some call it myth disguised as paperwork. Others say it's tribal memory stretched and warped over millennia. But there's one thing nobody can really ignore. The flood is not a Sumerian exclusive. You see it in Akkadian epics. You see it in Hebrew scripture. You see it in Hindu Puranas. You see it in Greek myths about Deucalion. You see it in stories from the Americas and islands across the Pacific. Different continents, different languages, the same kind of world-ending water. How do cultures separated by oceans all remember the same type of ending? Maybe because it wasn't just a story. Maybe because around 12,800 BC, something real happened. Something violent enough to carve itself into both the landscape and the human mind. Geologists have a name for the event that sits right on that edge, the Younger Dryas. More specifically, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The evidence isn't written in clay, it's written in mud and ice. In layers of sediment across multiple continents, you find weird fingerprints, sudden spikes of platinum, nanodiamonds, and tiny glassy spherules formed under extreme heat. You see black layers rich in soot and charcoal, suggesting massive wildfires. You see abrupt drops in temperature in ice cores. You see signs of mega floods ripping across ancient river systems. Within a few centuries, global sea levels surged more than 120 meters. Entire coastlines vanished. Places that would have been perfect for early human settlements, broad, flat, fertile, close to rivers, are now the floors of oceans. Ice sheets collapsed. Rivers changed course. Animals disappeared forever. And somewhere inside that chaos, according to the king list, the old rulers disappeared too. Now picture one of those tablets sitting under glass in Berlin or London. If you could reach in and pick it up, it would feel heavier than it looks. The clay is baked hard, still carrying grit from a riverbed long gone. On the surface, the wedge-shaped impressions of the stylus march across in neat lines. Each stroke is deliberate. Each sign is part of a system the scribe learned over years of training. Look closer at the edge, and sometimes you'll see it. A fingerprint, the faint looped ridges of a thumb pressed into soft clay 4,000 years ago, when the tablet was still wet. That scribe had a name, a family, a life. They weren't writing fantasy. They thought they were preserving memory. Memory of a time when kingship itself was different. When kings didn't rule for decades, but for ages. When authority was spoken of as something that descended, not something you seized. The Sumerians said kingship descended from heaven, not as a pretty metaphor, not in a hymn, in what reads like a straightforward historical statement, as if, once upon a very real time, power came from somewhere else, and when the flood came, that connection snapped. Afterward, someone had to rebuild it with fragments. When archaeologists dug at Eridu, the city Sumerians considered their oldest and holiest. They expected early civilization to look basic. Rough buildings, simple shrines, trial and error city planning. They didn't get that. They found temple foundations aligned to celestial directions. They found layered rebuilding on the same sacred spot over and over. They found irrigation and planning that didn't look like a first attempt at anything. Eridu wasn't a beginning, it was already a rebuild. You see the same pattern at Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, a megalithic temple complex dating to around 11,600 BC, right at the end of the Younger Dryas chaos. Massive stone pillars, carved with animals and symbols, arranged in circles that suggest astronomical intent. No pottery, no domesticated crops at the site, no slow evolution of architecture, just boom. Sophisticated design at the very edge of the Ice Age. It feels less like the dawn of civilization and more like a monument left by survivors. These places don't look like people slowly inventing culture from scratch. They look like people remembering, as if what we call the birth of civilization was actually the second act, a restoration after something older had been drowned. That's the question that hangs over every museum case and every clay fragment in storage. If the Sumerians weren't the first, then who were they copying? If their flood isn't just a metaphor, but a blurry echo of a real planetary disaster, then what kind of world did that flood erase? And if those pre-flood kings, the ones with reigns measured in tens of thousands of years, represent something real, even in distorted form, what happened to the very last of them? The tablets don't tell you. They just draw the line. Before, flood, after. Late at night, when the museum floors are empty and the lights are low, I like to imagine those tablets resting in the dark, still doing the job they were made to do, fighting against forgetting. The Sumerians were terrified of losing the past. That's why they trusted clay, because clay lasts. That's why they recopied the king list for centuries, even as their own culture was falling apart around them. They knew they were already living in a second world. They didn't want a third one to forget. They almost failed. The tablets almost didn't survive. Huge chunks of this story are still missing. Somewhere under the waters of the Persian Gulf, where sea levels rose, those 120 meters after the Ice Age, lie coastlines that once were home. Somewhere in ancient river silt, the cities of the pre-flood world sleep undiscovered. And somewhere in the narrow gap between geology and mythology, between what the earth remembers and what the clay insists on repeating, the shadow of the last Anunnaki king waits. Not as a lightning-throwing god, not as a cartoon alien, but as the final echo of a world that ended when the planet flipped the table on its own. If those tablets really are remembering rulers erased by a 13,000-year disaster, then who were they? And what does it actually mean to say, then the flood swept over? So if these tablets really are echoing the memory of rulers erased by catastrophe, who were those kings supposed to be? And what kind of reign lasts longer than recorded history itself? The Sumerian king list doesn't ease you in. It just drops you straight into the deep end with its opening move. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu, not after people started organizing villages, not after the first chief appeared. No, descended from heaven. Like kingship is not something people invented. It's something that arrived, complete, from somewhere else and landed in Eridu, this muddy little settlement that would become Sumer's most sacred city. From there, the list starts rolling through names, and this is where it gets weird. The first king is Alulim. He rules in Eridu for 28,800 years. After him, Alalga takes over, 36,000 years. Then Enmenluana in Bad Tibira, 43,200 years. The list keeps going like this. 8 kings in total before the flood, 5 cities, combined duration, 241,200 years. That's longer than the entire history of agriculture, longer than the time between cave paintings and today, all crammed into a single political tradition. Now, modern brains see those numbers and instantly go, okay, obviously symbolic. Myth, metaphor. No one is actually living 43,000 years. And sure, that's a valid instinct. But here's what makes it harder to just shrug and move on. The tone never changes. The language used for these insane reign lengths is the exact same dry, administrative style used later for kings we can verify archaeologically. No shift into poetic rhythm. No once upon a time. No divine fireworks between entries. Just name, city, duration, next. A scribe describing a king who supposedly ruled for 43,200 years uses the same grammar as one describing a king who ruled for 18 years in 2000 BC. To the people copying this stuff, this wasn't filed under fairy tale. It was filed under record. That matters because the Sumerians were obsessive record keepers. They had separate categories for mythic poetry, for hymns, for legal contracts, and for administrative stuff like this. The king list sits firmly in the bureaucratic document lane, not the epic myth lane. So either they had a completely different sense of what years meant in the far past, or they were trying to describe a kind of rulership that wasn't like normal human kingship at all. Enter the Anunnaki. In Sumerian cosmology, the Anunnaki weren't just vague gods floating around in the sky. They show up as actual players in the story, judges, council members, decision makers, beings tied directly to law, fate, and kingship. The name is usually translated as something like of royal seed or princely blood. In other words, a lineage. In the myths, the Anunnaki decide the creation of humans, vote on the flood, assign destinies, and show up again and again around kingship and civilization. To the Sumerians, power didn't start at the bottom and go up. It started above and came down. So when the king list says kingship descended from heaven, it's basically saying we got rulership from the Anunnaki, from the ones up there. That frames those pre-flood kings in a different light. They're not just early kings. They're part of the divine order, or at least directly authorized by it, which might explain why their reigns are measured on a scale that feels more cosmic than human. Then, all at once, that order breaks. The list gives you name after impossible name, ridiculous reign after ridiculous reign, and then hits you with one blunt sentence. Then the flood swept over. No backstory, no build-up, just end of that world. And on the very next line, the entire system collapses into something recognizably mortal. The next king, post-flood, rules for 1,200 years. Still wild, but already a massive downgrade. Then 960, then 670. The numbers keep dropping, like someone steadily turning down the dial on a cosmic clock. By the time we get to kings whose inscriptions we can actually cross-check with ruins and archaeology, we're down to 40 years. 30 years normal reigns, normal lives. The king list doesn't just record a flood, it records a change in the nature of time itself. Before the flood, rulers plugged into something massive, something astronomical. After the flood, rulers like us. Long-lived, maybe, but not cosmic. So what happened? Some scholars try to decode the numbers rather than dismiss them. They point out that many of those huge reigns are multiples of 3,000 to 600, a number called Asar in Sumerian mathematics. So, 28,000. 800 equals 8 SARs. 36,000 equals 10 SARs. 43,000. 200 equals 12 SARs. Maybe, they say, these weren't meant as actual birthdays, but as encoded cycles, astronomical periods, ceremonial ages, or dynastic eras expressed with sacred math. Even if that's true, the pattern doesn't go away. Even in that reading, before the flood, kingship is keyed to cosmic cycles. After the flood, kingship is tied to human spans. In every interpretation, that one line, then the flood swept over, is the boundary where the rules change. On one side, the age of what we might call Anunnaki kings. On the other, the age of human kings trying to imitate gods they no longer walk beside. In some versions of the king list, the last of those pre-flood rulers is called Ubara Tutu, ruling in the city of Shuruppak. In Sumerian flood myths, his son shows up under another name, Ziusudra. Ziusudra is basically the Sumerian Noah. He's the man warned by the god Enki that a flood is coming. He's told to build a boat to preserve the seed of all living things. He survives the deluge, offers sacrifice afterward, and is granted eternal life. Here's the important detail. Ziusudra is described as a king of a real city, Shuruppak. He's not just some random farmer. He's the last ruler of the old world. When the waters recede, he doesn't go back to his city. It's gone, buried. In the Akkadian version of the story, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, he appears as Utnapishtim. Same basic structure. The gods decide to wipe out humanity. One god secretly warns a single righteous man that man survives in a boat while the rest of the world drowns. It's not subtle. This is the reboot point. What's fascinating is that the king list doesn't dramatize any of this. It doesn't describe the storm, the ark, the panic. It leaves all of that to the myths. The king list just does this. 8 kings, 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven again. That little word again is doing a lot of work. It implies the first era of kingship came from heaven, from the Anunnaki. That era ended in the flood. Then, at some later point, kingship was reinstated, but under different conditions, the same source of authority, but in a much smaller world. If the pre-flood kings were really tied into some cosmic order, if their reigns were measured not in birthdays, but in cycles, in SARs, in relationships to the stars, to planetary motions, then the flood is not just bad weather, it's the breaking of a synchronization. Whatever allowed those rulers to be plugged in like that stops. The connection is cut. The world moves into a different mode. Now, here's where this stops being just an old story and starts lining up uncomfortably with actual Earth history. Because when you put that flood line up against the geological record, the timing is suspiciously close. Ancient texts. There was a time of strange, long-lived rulers. Then catastrophe. Then a smaller, shorter-lived world. Geology. There was a long, weird Ice Age state. Then, around 12,800 BC, something slammed the climate system. Firestorms, meltwater floods, rising seas, ecosystems collapse. Afterward, a new, warmer but unstable world. We're not saying the Sumerians had charts of ice cores and comet models. We're saying, if your ancestors lived through the Younger Dryas chaos, through real mega floods, real sea level rise, real sky on fire events, you would remember. You'd tell stories. Those stories would blend and blur over thousands of years. The details would drift, but the structure would remain. There was a world before. Something terrible happened. The rulers of that world disappeared. We live in what came after. That's the skeleton under all these myths from Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, India, Mesoamerica. Different names, same blueprint. So when the Sumerian king list marks a hard line and says, before this, kingship was different, it might not just be talking about politics. It might be talking about the moment the planet itself forced a hard reset. To really feel what that reset meant, you have to leave the museum lights and go back, not 5,000 years, not even 10,000, all the way back to around 13,000 BC, and step into a world that doesn't look like ours at all. Picture Earth, then. Massive ice sheets, some over 3 kilometers thick, still smothering North America, Scandinavia, and northern Russia. So much water locked up in that ice that global sea level is about 120 meters lower than it is today. That means what we now call the North Sea, dry land, the English Channel, a wide river valley, the Persian Gulf, not a gulf at all, but a huge fertile basin crisscrossed by rivers, coastlines everywhere, pushed far out, exposing huge stretches of land we don't even think about because they're underwater now. If humans were building anything advanced during the Ice Age, where would they do it? Not up on frozen plateaus. They'd stick to river deltas and coastal plains, the exact areas that are now drowned. For thousands of years, that frozen world is harsh, but stable enough for people to adapt. They follow herds, they fish rivers, they learn the rhythms of a cold but predictable planet. And then, something snapped. Around 12,800 BC, the climate suddenly plunges back into deep cold after a period of warming. Geologists call this the Younger Dryas. Nice, calm name. The reality was anything but calm. Across layers of sediment in North America, Europe, and the Middle East, you find the same signal, a dark band full of soot and microscopic glassy particles, a continent-wide burn layer, not a few forest fires, something like the planet got flash-broiled. Mixed into that layer, spikes of platinum, nanodiamonds, and tiny melted spherules, all things that tend to show up when something in space hits Earth or explodes in the atmosphere with ridiculous energy. The leading idea, still debated, still controversial, is that fragments of a disintegrating comet slammed into or exploded over the northern hemisphere. Not one giant dinosaur killer, but multiple blasts and airbursts. If that's right, the chain reaction would have been brutal. Shock waves flattening forests, thermal pulses igniting vegetation across entire regions, ice sheets flash melting on the surface, black smoke and dust thrown into the atmosphere. The result? Sky on fire, then sky gone dark. But the worst part isn't even the initial chaos. It's what happens when all that ice starts to move. As the ice sheets destabilize, glacial lakes the size of small seas suddenly drain. Meltwater pulses gush out in megafloods, carving new channels across the land in days. A lake like Agassiz in North America, bigger than all the Great Lakes combined, can drain catastrophically and dump unimaginable amounts of fresh water into the oceans. Those huge injections of cold, fresh water don't just raise sea levels, they mess with the ocean conveyor belt currents like the Gulf Stream that distribute heat around the planet. You shut that down, or even just wobble it, and climates swing hard. Europe snaps back into near Arctic conditions. Monsoon patterns shift, rain belts move, food webs crash, and all the while, the sea keeps creeping up, not in a single movie-style wave, in a slow, relentless invasion, year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation, the water rises. Over the span of a few thousand years, global sea levels climb about 120 meters. Every coastal settlement, every riverside camp, every low-lying plain where people had lived for centuries, gone. Now zoom in on the ancient Near East. During the Ice Age, the Tigris and Euphrates don't empty into a shallow gulf like today. They snake through a deep, exposed basin, the floor of what will become the Persian Gulf, before finally meeting the distant ocean much farther south. That basin? Likely one of the best pieces of real estate on Earth at the time. Multiple rivers, mild climate compared to the ice-choked north, estuaries full of fish and shellfish, fertile floodplains. If you were going to build early towns, or even something more advanced, that's where you'd do it. And that's exactly the place that slowly drowns as the ice melts. Imagine growing up in that valley. Your grandparents farmed here. Your temples are here. Your origin myths are tied to that land. Then, across your lifetime, the salt water keeps coming. First, the low fields are unusable. Then the old village is abandoned. Then the ruins themselves disappear underwater. By the time a few centuries have passed, the entire basin is gone. What used to be your world is now the bottom of the Persian Gulf. If there was a sophisticated coastal culture before Sumer, built on those now submerged lands, we'd barely have a clue. You can't dig what you can't reach. Most of what we think of as the archaeological record is just what's left on the dry 2/3 of the planet, and mostly on the parts we've bothered to excavate. From the perspective of survivors pushed inland, the story writes itself. Once, before the waters rose, there were great cities. Once, rulers lived for ages and walked with gods. Then the gods sent the flood. The old cities drowned. The old kings vanished. We live in the small world that came after. That's the emotional logic encoded in myth. And the thing is, Mesopotamia is not alone in telling that story. In the Atrahasis myth, the gods decide humans are too noisy. They send plague, drought, then finally a flood. One man, Atrahasis, is secretly warned by the god Enki to build a boat. He loads animals and craftsmen on board. 7 days of violent rain, and everything else is gone. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim tells the same tale with different names. The gods panic when they see the destruction. They regret what they've done. After the waters recede, Utnapishtim and his wife are granted eternal life, but they don't go back home. Their old world doesn't exist anymore. In the older Sumerian version, the flood hero is Ziusudra, king of Shurupak, the same city whose last pre-flood ruler, the king list, calls Ubara Tutu. So, the text quietly connects the dots. There's a last pre-flood king. His city is Shurupak. His son is the guy in the Ark story. After him, kingship has to descend from heaven, again in a new, smaller world. Now shift your camera to Egypt, where they talk about Zep-Tepi, the first time, when gods ruled directly on earth before handing over to human pharaohs. To Greece, where Hesiod writes about a golden age under Kronos, followed by decline, followed by a world-cleansing flood, survived only by Deucalion and Pyrrha. To India, where Manu is warned by a fish about a coming deluge, rides out the flood in a boat, and steps into a changed world. To Mesoamerica, where the Maya and Aztecs talk about earlier suns worlds that ended in catastrophe, including one wiped out by water. Different cultures, different continents, no emails, no shared Netflix specials, same skeleton, golden time, divine rulers, catastrophe, flood survivors, reduced world. We can't prove they all remembered the exact same Younger Dryas event in a neat, straight line. Myth doesn't work that cleanly. It blends, it compresses. Local floods get mixed with older memories. The Ice Age coastline drownings get folded into river flood trauma closer in time. But when everyone keeps saying, there was a world before, it ended in water, the rulers of that world were not like us. It's probably not just random storytelling. And in Mesopotamia, that idea gets crystallized into one character, the last Anunnaki king. Whether that was a real individual or a composite symbol, he's the figure standing on that invisible shoreline between two worlds. Behind him, a drowned age of cities we can't excavate. In front of him, Sumer, Eridu, Uruk, the world of clay tablets and ziggurats. Which raises the next question the king list never answers out loud. If an entire order of kings vanished with that world, what traces of their system did the Sumerians think they were bringing back when they rebuilt civilization? The Sumerians would have answered that question with one simple line they repeat again and again. After kingship descended from heaven. That's how the Sumerian king list actually starts. Not after humans figured out how to organize themselves. Not after the first village got big enough to need a leader, but after kingship descended from heaven. Kingship was in Eridu, not invented in Eridu, not voted in, descended, as if rulership itself was a package, a complete operating system that arrived from somewhere else and installed itself in one city. Then the list just runs with it. First king, Alulim of Eridu, reign 28,800 years. Second, Alalgar of Eridu, reign 36,000 years. Then Enmen Luana of Bad Tibira, 43,200 years. Enmengal Ana, 28,800 years. Dumuzid the Shepherd, 36,000. Ensipad Zid Ana, 28,800. Enmendur Ana of Sippa, 21,000. Ubara Tutu of Shurupak, 18,600. 8 kings, 5 cities, 241,200 years. And then, like we've seen one brutally spare sentence, then the flood swept over. What's easy to miss is how this is written. The tone doesn't change between Alulim ruled 28,800 years and so ruled 24 years. The scribes don't switch into poetry. They don't go, in days of legend, before the moon remembered its own name. It's all the same dry, bureaucratic, admin voice they use for tax lists and grain receipts. To them, this wasn't storytelling. This was record keeping. And that makes the weirdness heavier, not lighter, because the Sumerians weren't sloppy. They were obsessive archivists. They categorized myths separately from contracts, hymns separately from royal decrees. They knew the difference between a ritual song and a business document. The king list lives on that business document side of the line. So from their point of view, the pre-flood kings were as real as the later, historically confirmed ones. Just different. So who did they think these first kings were? That's where the Anunnaki come in. In Sumerian cosmology, the Anunnaki aren't just vague, sky-floating gods. They're very concrete figures. Judges, decision-makers, arbiters of fate, keepers of cosmic order. Their name is often translated as those of royal seed or offspring of the prince. It's all about lineage and authority. They show up in creation myths as the beings who shape humanity, in flood stories as the council that decides to wipe it out, in temple hymns as the ones who grant kingship and legitimacy. And crucially, the line between Anunnaki and kings is blurry. In the Sumerian view, kingship is divine technology, something the gods either embody or delegate, not something humans just invent when things get crowded. A king isn't just a strong man with an army. He's supposed to be the anchor point where heaven's order connects to earth. So when the king list opens with, after kingship descended from heaven, it's basically saying, after the Anunnaki system of rulership was installed, the first node was Eridu, and the kings who come after that aren't just local tribal leaders, they're plugged into that cosmic system. Those insane reign lengths? That might be the text's way of saying, these guys weren't operating on human time. And then, the flood. The king list doesn't elaborate. It doesn't describe the storm, or the waves, or the terror. It just drops that single line like a guillotine. Then the flood swept over. After that, everything changes. Rains shrink from tens of thousands of years to 1,200, then 960, then 670, then, by the time we reach rulers we can cross-check with excavation, you're at normal human lifespans. 40 years, 30 years. It's as if the power source was unplugged. The cosmic scale collapses into the human scale, whatever kingship from heaven meant before the flood. Afterward, it's something less. Some scholars have tried to tame this by saying, well, those numbers are symbolic. They're probably not years, they're cycles based on 3,000, 600, the Tsar, and they're not wrong that the math is interesting. A lot of those reign lengths are neat multiples of 3,000, 600, 28,000. 800 equals 8 times 3,000, 600, 36,000 equals 10 times 3,000, 600, 43,000, 200 equals 12 times 3,000, 600. So maybe, they argue, the king list is sneaking astronomy or sacred numerology into its timeline. Maybe those kings rule for X great cycles, not literal years. But even if that's true, you still run into the same wall. Before the flood, time is measured one way. After the flood, it's measured another. The whole structure of kingship changes. You don't fix the weirdness by calling it symbolism. You just confirm that even in symbolic time, there's a hard break. And right at that break sits Ubaratutu, the last pre-flood king, the man at the edge of the old world. He's ruler of Shuruppak, the city that shows up in the flood myths as the last hub of the old age. His son is Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, The man Enki warns in secret, tear down your house and build a boat. So in one dense knot of tradition you get the last king, the last city, and the man who survives to tell the story. By the time kingship descends from heaven again, in the post-flood world, everything is smaller, weaker, more distant. The Anunnaki don't walk among humans anymore. Kings build ziggurats to reach toward heaven instead of ruling as if they're halfway in it. Something broke, and in the Sumerian worldview, that break wasn't just about water, it was about connection. Now, take that break and lay it next to the timeline we looked at earlier, the Younger Dryas cataclysm around 12,800 BC, the long, chaotic recovery, the final abrupt warming and sea level surge finishing around 11,600 BC. That 11,600 date? Plato gives the same number in his story of Atlantis 9,000 years before Solon, which places it right at the end of the Younger Dryas. Göbekli Tepe rises around that same pivot. Massive stone circles, animal carvings, possible sky mappings, a megalithic project built by people who, on paper, are still hunter-gatherers. No pottery, no bricks, no metal, but they can move 10-ton pillars and align them to the stars. We see something similar in Mesopotamia, just much later. When the archaeologists go to Eridu the city, the king list calls the first seat of kingship. They don't find a clumsy experimental village. They find layers of temples built in the same spot, each one carefully aligned to the one beneath it. The earliest structures already have clear design, already have sacred geometry, already act like the builders are preserving a pattern, not inventing it. You start to get the feeling that the pre-flood world was coastal and is now underwater. The survivors moved inland and uphill. Sacred knowledge about stars, measures, rituals, and kingship was carried in their heads, their stories, and maybe in a few surviving artifacts. And then those survivors, or their descendants, spent thousands of years trying to rebuild a version of what they'd lost. Not perfectly, not completely, just enough that 5,000, 6,000 years later, a scribe in Nippur could still press into clay. There were kings before us. Their world ended, ours began afterward, and he could still name the last one. So, what did the Sumerians think they were restoring from that earlier world? To answer that, we have to leave the kings for a moment and look at something more slippery. Their language, their numbers, and the way they thought time itself was structured. Sumerian is weird. Not just old and hard to read weird, more like shows up out of nowhere and doesn't seem to be related to anything weird. When scholars finally cracked cuneiform in the 19th century, they were expecting to slot Sumerian into some known family tree. Maybe it would connect to Semitic languages like Akkadian and Hebrew, maybe to Indo-European branches like early Iranian or something even older. Instead, they found nothing, no cousins, no parents, no clear ancestors. Sumerian is a language isolate. It appears in the record already complex, already fully formed, with a grammar that lets you express subtle shades of time, cause, possibility, and obligation. It has specialized vocabulary for astronomy, architecture, law, ritual, administration. It shows up around 3,500 BC, like it's been in use for centuries or longer before anyone thinks to write it down. And then, by around 2000 BC, nobody speaks it anymore. Akkadian takes over in daily life. People buy and sell and argue and gossip in a completely different language. But here's the twist. For over 1,000 years after it dies as a spoken tongue, Sumerian refuses to go away. It becomes a sacred language. Scribes learn it in school, the way medieval monks learned Latin or Indian priests learned Sanskrit. They copy Sumerian hymns, rituals, law codes, mathematical tables, astronomical records. They keep bilingual dictionaries, Sumerian in one column, Akkadian in the other. They don't do this for nostalgia. They do it because, to them, Sumerian isn't the old language. It's the language of the gods, the language of deep time, the language of how reality works. Temple rituals had to be recited in Sumerian to be effective. Royal inscriptions sprinkled Sumerian titles and formula lines even when the rest was in Akkadian. If you wanted to talk to the cosmos properly, you used this dead language that nobody spoke on the street. That alone tells you something. They believed power lived in the structure of the words. And when you zoom into those words, you start to see why. Take their number system. We still live inside it. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. That's Sumerian sexagesimal math base 60, still running under our modern world like ancient code. Why 60? The easy explanation is because 60 has a lot of divisors, so fractions are neat. And that's true. You can split 60 evenly into 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30. Very handy if you're dividing land, calculating grain rations, or tracking time. But there's another layer. Base 60 is perfect for astronomy. It fits beautifully with cycles of the sky, angles, arcs, periods, conjunctions. The Sumerians were tracking Venus's motion, lunar months, and longer cycles with a precision that doesn't look like someone just playing around with sticks in the dirt for a generation or two. It looks like a heritage system, a set of tools that had been refined over a long stretch of time, then imported into the river valleys and plugged into a new civilization. Like someone arriving in a new workshop and saying, "Don't worry about inventing your own measuring tape. We brought this one with us." Then there's the vocabulary itself. Sumerian doesn't separate the physical and the cosmic the way we do. The word An means sky, heaven, the god An, the supreme deity, and carries the sense of high, bright, above. Those aren't metaphors. That's a single conceptual package. Sky equals heaven equals deity's realm. Another word, Kur, means mountain, foreign land, and underworld. To us, those are wildly different concepts. To them, they're all the place beyond here, the edge, the boundary realm. In other words, geography and cosmology are fused. Mountains are not just rocks, they're thresholds. Foreign lands are not just over there, they're liminal spaces. The underworld isn't just beneath, it's other. Their key term, me, or may, is even stranger. We've met it before. It doesn't just mean laws or skills. It's more like archetypes of civilization, the blueprints for kingship, music, crafts, justice, cities, rituals. The me are the cosmic settings for reality. You don't invent them, you receive them. The gods hold them, guard them, distribute them. Humans only have civilization because the me are allowed to flow down into the human world. That's exactly how the king list talks about kingship. After kingship descended from heaven, same logic. Kingship isn't a social invention. It's a download. Then the flood hits. The connection glitches. The download fails halfway. Before the flood, kings reign in cosmic cycles. Time is measured in great units. Rulers are plugged into heavenly order directly. After the flood, kings reign like humans. Time shrinks to lifespans. Rulers can only symbolically mirror cosmic order, not embody it. You can see this shift structurally in their language and culture too. In the earliest layers, rulers are deeply tied to priestly roles. The N A title for lord can be both king and high priest. Governance is ritual. Ritual is governance. The king's core job is to keep the cosmos in sync, maintain temple rites, calibrate the calendar to the sky, handle the me correctly. Later, as we move further away from the flood boundary, kingship becomes more familiar. War campaigns, walls and fortifications, tax systems, political alliances. The cosmic job doesn't vanish, but it fades into ceremony. It's still there in coronations, in temple constructions, in star-aligned ziggurats, but it's no longer the center of rulership. If you put that shift next to the king list's numbers, you get a clear narrative. Pre-flood, kings live in Anunnaki time. Cosmic cycles, long spans, direct connection. Post-flood, kings live in human time. Decades, generations, dynasties. The last Anunnaki king sits exactly at that fault line. We don't know if Anunnaki king is what they themselves would have called him, but symbolically, that's what he is. The last ruler of the old order, the last person whose title is anchored to that direct heavenly kingship, the final point where language, numbers, and cosmic law all still line up. After him, everything is restoration, not continuation. And the people doing the restoring, the scribes, the guys hunched over tables in places like Nippur and later Nineveh, copying texts by lamplight, pressing wedge after wedge into damp clay. They're the ones who carry that pre-flood echo through time. They preserve the king list, the flood stories, the star tables, the base 6-0 math, the ritual formulas in Sumerian, long after nobody speaks it on the street. They're not just clerks, they're memory engineers. In their world, language and numbers weren't neutral tools, they were survival tech. Language preserved the logic of the old world. Numbers preserved its timing and patterns. Myths preserved its story. And all three converge in that single, razor-thin line. Then the flood swept over, which leads to a harder question the Sumerians probably felt, but never spelled out. If kingship can descend from heaven twice, if one entire age of rulers can vanish in water and fire, what guarantee do you have that it won't happen again? And that's where, thousands of years later, their story starts to sound uncomfortably like ours. If that sounds abstract, let's bring it down to dirt and dust and actual rooms where this memory work happened. Picture the ruins of ancient Nippur in southern Iraq, late 1800s. The air is hot and still. Archaeologists are expecting the usual broken walls, a few statues, scattered pottery. Instead, they find rooms filled with clay. Not gold, not jewelry, just shelves and piles of tablets, tens of thousands of them. Some are neat, rectangular and clean. Others are broken, scattered like pieces of a civilization-sized jigsaw puzzle. Many still have the faint imprint of fingers in the clay thumbs and palms that set them down 3,000 years ago and walked away, never imagining strangers in hats and beards would dig them up and stare at their handwriting. These rooms weren't treasure vaults, they were archives. Nippur was less a regular city and more a knowledge hub, a library temple. The people who worked there weren't warriors or kings, they were scribes, human photocopiers with astonishing patience, and they wrote down everything. Legal contracts and court cases, land sales and tax receipts, omens and prophecies, medical recipes and spells, math homework, star tables, hymns, myth cycles, and king lists. To us, it looks like a random mess. To them, it was a shield against oblivion. Because here's the thing, by the time many of those tablets were written, the people of Mesopotamia already knew what it meant to lose everything. They carried that fear inside their stories. They believed the world had ended once before, Not just a bad flood year ended, but world ended in water, chaos, and almost total erasure. And that somewhere behind them, behind the flood in their myths and the line in their king list, there was a whole age that had been wiped clean. So they fought back the only way they could. They turned memory into an object. A tablet isn't just information. It's time, solidified. It takes a thought, a story, a record of who owned which field, and locks it into baked earth. Fire and water can destroy almost anything. Clay, once fired, is stubborn. It breaks. But it doesn't rot. You can burn a library of papyrus. You can't burn a library of clay. You just bake it harder. That's not an accident. That's design. You can feel the psychology behind it. The last time the world ended, almost everything was lost. Not this time. Not on my watch. And that instinct to preserve, to drag the past forward, doesn't stop in Sumer. Fast forward to the 7th century BC and move north to the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. The king there, Ashurbanipal, is not a gentleman. He's a warlord. But he's also a book nerd in the most terrifying way possible. He conquers cities and then orders his agents to loot their libraries. He sends scribes out with one main job: bring me texts, especially the old ones, especially Sumerian ones. In his palace, he builds what we now call the Library of Ashurbanipal, an immense collection of tablets, over 30,000 pieces. And over, in the little notes, scribes add at the end of a tablet the colophons. You see phrases like, copied from an ancient tablet, according to its original, for the future. He knows he's at the tail end of something. He can feel time closing in. Ashurbanipal calls himself the king who learned the wisdom of the ancients. He boasts that he has acquired the secret knowledge from before, from Sumer and Akkad. He doesn't claim to have invented this wisdom. He claims to have rescued it. The scribes in his library are doing the same work as the scribes in Nippur centuries earlier. Copy, preserve, repeat. Copy, preserve, repeat. They treat Sumerian texts like sacred fossils. They don't fully understand where those stories and numbers came from. They don't know the names of the first people who worked out base 60 or tracked Venus across the sky for centuries. They just know this. This knowledge is old. It works. We can't let it die. And underneath that, the unspoken anxiety. It died once already. It's kind of fascinating because right at the root of their worldview is that break we've been circling. The flood, the line that split time in two, the end of the age of the long-reigning kings. You can almost hear the echo in their behavior. The last age lost almost everything. We'll lose things too, cities, empires, maybe our own language. But if we keep copying, maybe something will make it through. Here's the cruel irony. They were right and they were wrong. Nippur's scribal schools faded. Nineveh burned in 612 BC. Ashurbanipal's library collapsed in fire and rubble. But that fire, it didn't destroy the tablets. It fired them. It accidentally gave us one of the best preserved archives in human history. Centuries later, when archaeologists dug up Nineveh, the tablets were still there, charred buildings, fallen walls, and in the wreckage, those little clay time capsules, waiting, same with Nippur, same with other sites. The empires died, the scribes vanished, the languages went silent. For about 2,000 years, no one on earth could read cuneiform at all. Their entire written world went dark. And then, in the 19th century, people started decoding the wedges, slowly, painfully, crack by crack. And as they did, something eerie happened. We started remembering them, remembering their attempt to remember someone else. We read their flood stories. We read their star charts. We read the Sumerian king list. We saw that strange, sharp line. Then the flood swept over. We saw the impossible rain lengths on one side and the ordinary lifetimes on the other. We saw the way they structured time, the way they preserved Sumerian after it died, the way they obsessed over old tablets restored. And we realized they were doing the same thing we're doing right now, staring into the past, trying to understand an age that vanished. They looked back toward the last Anunnaki king and the world before the flood. We looked back toward them and the world before writing went silent. And in that double reflection, there's a warning. Because if you strip away the mythology, the Anunnaki, the gods, and cosmic titles, there's something very human and very familiar underneath. Rising seas, violent climate shifts, ecosystems collapsing, cultures scrambling to preserve what they know. Their world literally ended in water and chaos, and they spent the rest of their history trying to make sure the memory of that world didn't end too. Now, here we are, watching ice sheets melt, watching coastlines erode, watching our own climate wobble and shudder. Our knowledge isn't baked into clay. It's sitting on hard drives, on servers, in data centers that only exist as long as the power stays on and the cooling systems work. It's easy to feel invincible when your information is everywhere. But digital memory is fragile. A server farm is one long power outage away from forgetting. Sumerian scribes understood something we tend to forget. Civilization is not guaranteed. Continuity is not guaranteed. There is no autosave for history. Someone has to copy the tablet. So when we talk about the last Anunnaki king, this final ruler of the pre-flood age, we're not just talking about some mythical being in a crown standing on a ziggurat while comets blaze overhead. We're talking about a boundary between cosmic time and human time, between direct connection and distant memory, between a world that thought it would last forever and the ocean. And maybe, without realizing it, we're standing closer to that kind of boundary than we'd like to admit, because if an entire age could be swallowed once, and all that survived were hints in myths and lists on clay, what does that say about our age, our rulers, our systems, our stories, and what will survive of them if something slams into our timeline the way the younger Dryas slammed into theirs? We don't have an answer yet, but the clay remembers why the question matters. So what do we actually do with a story like this? Because it's one thing to sit here at 2 a.m, listening to the quiet hum of your room while we talk about ice ages and clay tablets and kings whose names sound like echoes. It's another thing to ask, okay, and now what? Let's be honest. There are 3 easy ways to walk away from this. The first is to say, cool story, but it's just myth. None of this really happened like that. The second is to say, this proves everything advanced, lost civilization, Anunnaki, the whole package. The third is quieter, and maybe more uncomfortable. I don't know. But the pattern is weird, and it feels like it's pointing at something we don't fully understand. That third option is where I like to stay, because the Sumerian king list might preserve a distorted memory of real rulers from before the Younger Dryas cataclysm. Or it might be a complex literary construction built on symbolic numbers and sacred math. The pre-flood kings might be literal or astronomical, or both at once, in a way our binary brains struggle with. But either way, the structure of the story is doing something important. It's saying, there was a time before our time. There were rulers before our rulers. There was a world that ended so completely that all we have now are fragments and whispers. That's not just a theological claim. That's a psychological one. Human beings are not used to thinking over 13,000 years. Our lives are short. Our politics barely last a generation. Our news cycle resets every 24 hours. The king list throws a brick through that window and says, "You are living in the after. Please don't forget there was a before." And our geology, our climate science, our archaeology quietly nod along. Younger Dryas burn layer, glacial melt pulses, flooded continental shelves, submerged river valleys. The earth has receipts. So maybe the last Anunnaki king isn't a sky being in a literal spaceship. Maybe he's something scarier, a metaphor for how completely a world can vanish. Think about your own life for a second. If everything you know ended networks down, servers fried, cities flooded, what would survive 500 years from now? Your photos? Gone. Your emails? Gone. Your cloud? Only if someone's still keeping the machines alive. Most of what you think of as your world is made of light and electricity. Pull the plug long enough and it just evaporates. Now compare that to a clay tablet. No one has to maintain it. No one has to pay the hosting bill. It just sits there in the dirt and waits. The Sumerians didn't pick clay because they were primitive. They picked clay because they were traumatized. They lived in a landscape shaped by flood, by rivers that changed course, by cities that could be wiped out in a bad season. Behind all of that was the older, darker memory of a world-ending catastrophe their myths kept pointing at. So they started writing obsessively. King lists, star charts, ritual instructions, architectural ratios, medical recipes. Even their shopping lists ended up as archaeology. And here's the part that gets me. They weren't just writing about themselves. They were writing for us. Not consciously. Not like dear future people with smartphones, but in a deeper way. In those little colophons at the end of tablets, they say things like, "For future days." Let the wise instruct the wise. Copied from an old tablet, restored. They imagined someone after them, someone who might need to remember. They didn't know it would be us. We don't know who comes after us. But that act, writing toward the future while remembering the past, that's the thread that connects us directly to the scribes of Nippur, to the priests of Eridu, to the people who first pressed those wedge-shaped marks into wet clay. We're not so different. We worry about collapse too. Not just personal ruin, but civilizational collapse. Climate tipping points. Economic crashes. AI risk. Pandemics. Wars that don't turn off. Our version of the flood doesn't always involve water. Sometimes it's data breaches, or grid failures, or supply chains snapping like old rope. But the feeling is familiar. We're staring at graphs the way ancient priests stared at the sky, squinting, trying to read the omens, trying to figure out if we're standing near the edge of something. So when we read about pre-flood kings and 13,000-year cataclysms, we're not just indulging in ancient mystery, we're holding up a mirror. The Sumerians looked back at their own lost world and said, "There were once rulers so old we can't even measure their reign. There was once an order so cosmic we can only call it divine, and it ended." We look back at them and say, "There was once a civilization that thought clay and stone would outlast everything, and they were right, but only in fragments. Some of those fragments are myths. Some of them are math. Some of them are just names. Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana, Ubatutu. We don't know who they really were, if they existed at all in the way we use that word. But their purpose in the story is clear. They mark the scale of what can be lost. A world big enough, stable enough, confident enough to imagine rulers living for tens of thousands of years, gone. Replaced by a world where kings count their reigns in decades and hope the river doesn't flood their barley fields. We are the people of decades. We live in the short span world, the post-flood world, the scrolling world, and yet Buried inside our stories, our religions, our legends, even our science fiction, is this ache for something bigger. Ages instead of years. Cycles instead of straight lines. A sense that we're not actually at the beginning of anything, just in the middle of a very long, very messy story. Maybe that's what the last Anunnaki king really gives us. Not proof, not dogma, but scale, a sense of how far back human memory may stretch, and how thin the layer of everything we know really is. Underneath the asphalt and glass of our cities is soil. Underneath that soil is sediment. Underneath that sediment is a record of fire, ice, flood, impact. Underneath our stories are older stories, and under those, silence. For the people of Sumer, that silence had a shape. It was the flood. For us, it might be something else. But the emotional equation is the same. We know something ended before us. We're afraid something will end after us. So we try to remember, and we hope to be remembered. The clay tablets are their answer to that fear. Our answer might be different archives, backups, seed vaults, telescopes, decentralization. But at the heart of both is the same quiet request. Let this not all be for nothing. And somewhere inside that request, somewhere between the wet clay of Nippur and the glowing screen in your hand, the ghost of a king whose world ended 13,000 years ago still walks the perimeter of our imagination. Not to demand worship, just to remind us that worlds end, and that sometimes the only thing that crosses the water is a story. In the next and final part, I want to pull everything we've talked about down into one place. Myth, geology, Sumer, floods, kings, and us, and leave you with one last picture of that boundary between before and after, and why it matters that we keep listening to what the clay is trying to tell us. So let's pull all of this together into one picture. Not as a neat conclusion because there isn't one, but as a frame you can stand inside for a moment and just feel the scale of what we've been talking about. Imagine time as a shoreline. On the sand, right at the edge of the water, is us. Our phones, our satellites, our skyscrapers, our cloud servers humming in air-conditioned halls, our science, our myths, our wars, our playlists. Everything we call the modern world is right here, pressed up against the tide. Behind us, further inland, are other footprints. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, the Maya, the Olmec, ancient China, Greece, Rome. Kingdoms and empires that rose, burned bright, collapsed, and left stone and pottery behind like shells. And far out there, under the water where the waves are dark and the sand never sees the sun, is whatever came before. We can't see it directly. We can only infer its shape from layers of silt. The sudden jump in sophistication we see at places like Göbekli Tepe, the stranded mathematical genius of base 6-0, stories of golden ages and divine rulers that show up everywhere, and a strange list of kings on clay tablets that insists there was once an age when rulers were not like us. The last Anunnaki king stands right where the shoreline breaks. On one side, the drowned world of the Ice Age coasts. On the other, the fragile, flood-haunted world of Sumer and everyone who came after. Is he literal? Symbolic? A compressed memory of an entire lost elite? We don't know. And honestly, we don't have to decide to let him matter, because what he does in the story is clear. He is the marker, the sign that says, here the world you cannot remember ended. From here onward, you are living in the after. And that, weirdly, might be the most honest thing any ancient text has ever told us. We like to think we live at the beginning of history. In reality, we live in the middle of something. Sumer wasn't the beginning. It was a reboot. Egypt wasn't the beginning. It was a regional branch update. We're probably not the finale. We're another chapter. We've just been lucky enough to be born at a point where the climate is relatively stable, the ice is mostly melted, and the last big catastrophe is far enough behind us that we can call it prehistory and keep scrolling. But those clay tablets are not scrolling. They're not going anywhere. They sit in the dark and keep whispering. The world ended once. It can end again. That isn't doomsday preaching. It's context. When you know your species has already been knocked hard at least once by ice, fire, and rising water, your idea of normal changes. You stop thinking in election cycles and start thinking in layers. What survives a blackout? What survives a grid failure? What survives 4 centuries without anyone paying the hosting bill? What survives when coastlines move and nobody remembers where the servers were buried? The Sumerians answered that with clay and stone and ritual repetition. They assumed nothing. They trusted nothing. They wrote everything. We trust everything. We assume the internet is eternal. We treat our entire civilization like a browser tab that will never crash. But if there's one thing the story of the last Anunnaki king is really about, it isn't ancient aliens or secret bloodlines. It's fragility, of power, of memory, of the stories we tell about ourselves. A world where kings could imagine ruling for thousands of years, anchored to the stars and cosmic cycles, evaporated so completely that its ruins, if they exist, are now fish habitats in the Persian Gulf. Our world feels unshakable in the same way. We talk about forever like it's a subscription tier. But from the perspective of the tablets, of the ice cores, of the stars, we're the quick part. The good news is, knowing that is power. Because if myth and geology and archaeology all agree on one thing, it's this. The only things that cross the flood are what we choose to carry. Skills, stories, principles, fragments of knowledge we value enough to defend. The pre-flood world, whatever it was, didn't carry everything across. That's why later civilizations are full of gaps and ghosts and numbers that don't quite make sense. They saved enough to rebuild, but not enough to remember clearly. So here's the late night question I want to leave you with. If you knew a flood was coming, not necessarily water, but any kind of world-ending break, what would you put on your clay tablet? What would you try to preserve for whoever comes after? A handful of scientific principles? Instructions on how to grow food and purify water? A library of stories so they know they weren't the first to feel afraid and hopeful and small? A warning carved into something that doesn't need electricity to speak? Because whether the last Anunnaki king was real or not, his role in our story is clear. He is the reminder that whole systems of meaning can disappear, that our version of how things are is not guaranteed to last, that we might be someone else's pre-flood world, and we will have no control over how they mythologize us. Maybe they'll remember us as gods of metal birds and glass rectangles, maybe as fools who drowned themselves in data and carbon, maybe as the people who saw the wave coming and finally learned from the last time. That part is still being written right now by you, lying there in the dark with this video in your ears, by me telling you about long-dead kings and broken coastlines, by scientists reading ice and dust, by archivists, programmers, farmers, engineers, storytellers, all doing the quiet work of carrying information across time. Somewhere, under museum glass, a clay tablet still holds the line. Then the flood swept over. One sentence, one boundary, one impossible memory. If we're lucky, thousands of years from now, someone will hold a fragment of our world and say, they knew they were fragile, and they tried to remember. If you've stayed with me all the way to this point, you're part of that work just by caring, by wondering, by letting this story expand the way you think about time. So, if you want more deep dives like this into the weird edges of history where myth and science overlap, make sure you're subscribed. Hit the like button so this reaches more night owls like you, and tell me in the comments, what would you put on your clay tablet? Because somewhere, between the sand and the deep water, between the last Anunnaki king and whatever comes after us, the story isn't over. We're still writing it. So maybe the real twist in this whole story isn't about the last Anunnaki king at all. Maybe it's about us. Because if you zoom out far enough, the pattern that keeps repeating isn't gods come down, gods disappear. It's this. A civilization rises. It believes, it understands its world. It trusts its systems. And then something bigger than its plans walks in. Ice, fire, water, time. The Sumerians built ziggurats, wrote laws, mapped the stars, and still lived in the shadow of a catastrophe that didn't just erase cities, it erased context. It took whatever came before them and turned it into rumour and symbol and half-remembered math. We're in a similar place. We just swap clay tablets for servers and styluses for touchscreens. Think about how much of our world only exists as long as the power stays on. Your photos, your messages, your money, your books, if you read on a screen, your knowledge, if you get it from links instead of libraries. Pull the plug on the system for a few decades, and almost everything we've made dissolves into unreadable noise. The Sumerians had something we don't: paranoia. They wrote like the flood was coming back. They carved into stone. They pressed into clay. They copied and recopied and recopied again, for centuries, in case the worst happened again. They knew what it was like to live after. We, on the other hand, behave like after is never coming. We tell ourselves the story that history is an arrow always moving forward, always improving, always progressing. But down in the dirt and ice and silt, the deeper story looks more like a heartbeat. Rise, break, remember, rebuild, repeat. The last Anunnaki king is just one pulse in that rhythm. He marks a moment when the line flatlined, when an age ended so completely, the survivors could only talk about it in the language of gods and immortals and impossible numbers. And you and I? We're living in the echo of that. We inherited a world that already had lost worlds buried underneath it. Flood myths, golden ages, divine rulers, cycles of time. All of that is humanity trying to drag the memory of one before across thousands of years of after. You can few Ephraim, you can few Ephraim. So here's the uncomfortable question. If someone 4,000 years from now dug through the rubble of our world, what story would they tell about us? Would we be their pre-flood kings? The ones who played with forces bigger than we understood? The ones who warmed the climate without a backup plan? The ones who thought data was permanent, right up until the moment it wasn't? Would we be remembered as gods of glass and fire, or as the people who saw what was coming and changed course just in time? Because here's the thing, we have something the Sumerians never had. We have their warning. They didn't know their ice sheets were collapsing or their coastlines were doomed until it was already happening. We do. We can measure it. We can model it. We can map the future shoreline in advance. We know sea levels are rising. We know weather systems are shifting. We know we're pushing the climate harder than at any point since the last big catastrophe. And we know, from their tablets and our satellites, that nobody is bigger than the planet. Not ancient kings, not modern nations, not us. That realization can feel crushing, or it can be clarifying, because it does something important. It shrinks our ego, but expands our responsibility. If history really does move in pulses, rise, break, remember, rebuild, then the only part we have any control over is how much we choose to remember and how gently we choose to break. Maybe we can't keep everything from falling apart, but we can decide what crosses the flood. That can be huge things like scientific knowledge, critical skills, ways of growing food that don't depend on fragile supply chains, or small things that mean more than we think, like stories that remind people they're not alone, that others have lived through endings and beginnings before. The scribes in Nippur didn't know which tablets would matter. They just saved all of it. Grain counts, king lists, medicine recipes, star charts, myths. To them, it was all part of the same fight, keeping the lights on in human memory. We're in that fight too, whether we notice it or not. Every time you read deeply, instead of scrolling past, every time you learn a skill with your hands, not just an app, every time you write something down in a form that doesn't need a battery, you're doing what they did. You're choosing clay over cloud. You're helping make sure that if our world ever has its own then the flood swept over moment, whoever comes after us doesn't have to start from zero. And that, weirdly, is where this ancient, almost mythic story drops right into your lap. The last Anunnaki king is not asking you to believe in him. He's asking you to pay attention to the shoreline, to the ice, to what we store and what we throw away, to how fragile power really is. No matter how eternal it feels in the moment, he's a ghost king in a broken list on a cracked tablet in a museum basement, but the pattern his story reveals is very alive. So next time you hear someone talk about the end of the world, remember this: the world has already ended, more than once. It ended for the mammoths. It ended for the people who built on coastlines that are now sea floor. It ended for the pre-flood kings, whoever they really were. And every time, someone survived. Someone copied the stories. Someone rebuilt. The question isn't, will it end? The question is, when it changes next, who will we have been? The ones who sleepwalked into the tide? Or the ones who listened to the oldest warnings we have scribed in clay, encoded in myth, etched into ice, and decided we didn't want to be remembered as just another lost age? You don't have to answer that right now. Just let it sit. Let it ride with you while you close this video, while the room goes quiet, while the night wraps around your window and the same stars that watched over Sumer look down on you. Somewhere under the desert, a tablet still whispers about a king whose world was washed away. Somewhere under the sea, ruins wait in the dark. Somewhere in your own lifetime, you'll have chances big and small to decide what you help carry forward. If you want more trips into this space, where ancient texts and modern science talk to each other, and history feels less like a textbook and more like a late-night story, make sure you're subscribed. Hit the like button so YouTube knows to show this to more people like you. And tell me in the comments, after everything you've heard, what do you want to see survive you? Because in the end, that's all kingship ever was. Not gold, not thrones, just the power to decide what outlives you. And whether your name ends up on a tablet, or just in the heart of someone who remembers you, that choice is still in your hands. If you're still here with me, hours or days or weeks after some Sumerian scribe pressed those wedge marks into wet clay, I want to try one last experiment with you. Not with the Anunnaki this time, with you. Imagine it's 12,000 years from now. Whatever happened between now and then has already happened. Maybe it was slow climate drift. Maybe it was one bad century. Maybe it was a chain of events that felt small at the beginning and enormous at the end. But the result is the same. Our cities are gone. Bangkok, New York, London, Dubai, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, all the lights that once glowed from space are dust and roots and unfamiliar forests. Rivers have moved, coastlines are different. The desert has taken some places, the sea has taken others. And somewhere, in what used to be a temperate zone, a small group of future archaeologists is digging. They don't call themselves archaeologists. Obviously, they're whatever their word is for those weird people who obsess over old stuff. One of them is in a trench, knee-deep in what used to be a living room. The concrete has crumbled. The wiring is just green-stained veins in the soil. They keep finding plastic everywhere, plastic that will outlive almost everything else we made. They brush away dirt, and their trowel touches something that doesn't disintegrate. It's a blocky little rectangle, heavy, dense, still mostly intact, an external hard drive. They don't know the word for it, but they know what it feels like, important. A week later, in a different settlement, one of the last surviving pockets of technological continuity, they manage to power it on, and suddenly, our world floods back. Not all of it, not clean, but flashes, news clips from this decade, old YouTube videos, frozen bank records, maps of cities that aren't there anymore, screenshots of comments from people whose bones are now soil. They scroll and scroll, trying to reconstruct us, our priorities, our fears, our gods. They see climate graphs and arguments in the comments below them. They see headlines about heat waves and ice sheets and record storms. They see documentaries about prehistory that ended right before people like them were born. And somewhere in that mess of data, maybe they find videos like this one. A guy talking softly into a microphone at 2 a.m, telling stories about the Sumerian king list and the last Anunnaki king and a 13,000-year cataclysm that nearly erased humanity. Imagine how that would look from their side. They'd see that we knew, not exactly, not precisely, but enough. Enough to understand that the climate can flip, enough to understand that sea levels can move like a living thing, enough to understand that civilizations can end so thoroughly the next round of humans will have to argue over whether we ever existed at all. They'd see our graphs and our satellites and our science, and then they'd see what we did anyway. They'd see the emissions numbers, the expansion of cities into floodplains, the building up of coasts we already knew would be underwater. They'd see, side by side, data saying, this is dangerous, stories warning, this has happened before, Rupling, and a whole culture scrolling past, both because it was tired or busy or just numb. From their perspective, would we look like the last kings before a flood? Would they tell stories about us the way the Sumerians told stories about the Anunnaki? Would they say, in the age before the waters rose, there were people who could see the whole planet at once. They mapped it, measured it, tracked its temperature and its storms. They knew what was coming. And still, most of them carried on as if the timeline would never break. Maybe they'd turn us into myths. Maybe they'd talk about the god of the sky screens who showed people everything and made them feel nothing. Maybe they'd talk about the priesthood of the cloud, those who guarded the servers where memory lived. Maybe they'd imagine we had powers we didn't have, lifespans we didn't possess, foresight we didn't always use, just like we did with the pre-flood kings. We looked back at echoes and filled in the gaps with divinity. They'd look back at us and do the same. Here's the part that sits with me. The Sumerians didn't know they were living in a story someone would binge-watch thousands of years later. They were just people, sweating over irrigation canals, arguing in markets, worrying about harvests and marriages and neighbours, trying to keep the river from swallowing their homes, trying to get through another year. Their myths, their math, their king lists, none of that felt like content. It was just how they made sense of a world that had already broken once. We are exactly the same. We're making TikToks and spreadsheets and laws and arguments and love and mistakes, and none of it feels like part of some epic arc. But it is. To someone in the future, if they're lucky enough to exist, we'll either be the forgotten layer like the drowned coastlines of the last ice age, or the inflection point, the people who broke the pattern, or at least bent it. And this is where the story circles back on itself. Because what did the Sumerians do, standing in the shadow of their own catastrophe? They preserved. They couldn't unflood the land. They couldn't uncollapse the ice. But they could decide what survived through it. They chose clay. They chose stone. They chose to copy and recopy the things they thought mattered most. Star paths, king lists, rituals, stories about floods and old worlds and kings who ruled too long. So here's the real question. This whole Anunnaki storyline is sneaking toward. What are we going to copy? Not literally with styluses and tablets, but with our attention. What are we keeping alive? We can't all build megaliths or carve myths into stone, but we can learn real skills and teach them. Support knowledge that doesn't vanish behind paywalls and passwords. Back up what matters in ways that don't depend on one company or one server farm. Keep telling stories that stretch backward, not just sideways. We can admit that we're not the first. We can act like we care whether we're the last. Maybe that sounds heavy. Maybe it's too much for a late-night video about a half-mythical king on a clay tablet. But I think this is what those old stories are for. Not to give us exact dates, or perfect chronologies, or secret alien histories, but to remind us that we are not immune, that other humans, just as smart and scared and hopeful as us, have watched their world end, and that even when it did, they found ways to push a little bit of themselves over the edge into whatever came next. So as we close this out, I want to leave you with one last image. A single tablet, baked clay, the size of your hand. A list of names, some real, some distorted by time. A flood line carved between worlds. It survived 4,000 years. It crossed empires. It lay buried in the dirt until someone brushed it off and realized it was a message from people who refused to let their memories drown. You are living in a time when you can send messages farther than any scribe ever dreamed of. Across oceans, across languages, across generations. You might not be able to stop every storm. You might not be able to fix every system, but you can decide what you carry, what you amplify, what you defend, what you refuse to let sink quietly beneath the surface. If you felt something during this journey, from clay shelves in museum basements to ice age floods to our own unstable present, let me know in the comments. What part hit you the hardest? What do you want future humans, if they're out there, to know about us? And if you want to keep exploring these fault lines between history and myth, science and story, past cataclysms and future choices, you know what to do. Subscribe. Hit the like button so this doesn't vanish in the algorithm flood. Share it with that one friend who stays up too late thinking about this kind of thing. Because the more of us are aware we're standing near a boundary in the timeline, the better chance we have of stepping over it intentionally, not just getting washed across it. Thanks for listening. Sleep well, or don't. Either way, remember, somewhere, under sand and under sea, other worlds ended. Ours doesn't have to end the same way. Maybe the strangest thing about this whole story isn't the impossible rain lengths, or the buried temples, or even the thought of a coastline full of drowned cities. Maybe the strangest thing is how familiar it all feels. Not the details, of course. None of us alive today have watched an ice sheet collapse with our own eyes. We haven't stood on a shoreline and seen the sea race inland so fast you could never outrun it. We haven't looked up at a sky on fire and thought, this is it, this is the end of the world. But we recognize the shape of the fear. The Sumerians lived with the memory of a flood so powerful that it rewrote the rules of kingship. The people who told the stories that became the Epic of Gilgamesh were already looking back at Zusudra's world, the way we look back at the dinosaurs, something that once existed, that once felt permanent and is now gone. And us? We live with graphs. We watch charts of sea level rise, temperature anomalies, glacial melt. We listen to scientists talk about tipping points and feedback loops. And deep down, even if we change the subject, even if we scroll away, we feel it in the same place the ancients felt the flood, in the gut. A sense that the ground under our civilization isn't as solid as we pretend. Imagine you could bring one of those Sumerian scribes forward in time and sit them in front of a satellite image. Show them the shrinking ice caps, the glowing veins of our cities at night, the hurricanes swirling over oceans. Then show them a simulation of a 2-meter sea level rise and watch the shorelines redraw. Would they see graphs, or would they see a new flood? We like to think of ourselves as completely different from them. We have space telescopes and AI and quantum computers. They had clay, reeds, and stars. But strip away the tools, and we're the same animal, staring at the sky, trying to understand what it means when the world we know starts changing too fast. The Sumerians responded to that fear by turning memory into ritual. They built temples on top of older temples, never letting the sacred ground go fallow. They aligned their cities to stars that rose from a sky older than their language. They copied tablets until their hands cramped, not because they loved homework, but because they were terrified of a second erasure, of becoming to some future people what the pre-flood world was to them. A rumor. We respond with backups, cloud storage, mirrored drives, off-site servers. We scatter our knowledge across data centers and assume redundancy equals safety. But here's the uncomfortable thought the Sumerian tablets whisper when you really let them in. Clay doesn't crash. If the power goes out, if the networks fail, if nobody pays the hosting bill on whatever glass and steel warehouse is keeping our eternal data alive, the bits go dark. In 1,000 years, a buried SSD is just a shiny rock. But a baked tablet? That thing can survive a palace fire, a flood, 1,000 years under mud, another 1,000 under sand. All it needs is someone, someday, who still remembers how to read. The Sumerians didn't know radiocarbon dates. They didn't know about comet fragments, or meltwater pulses, or orbital mechanics. But they did know this. Whatever had come before them had been almost completely erased. They lived in the shadow of that absence. Imagine being a scribe in Nippur, copying the king list. You know the names of the kings who walked your own streets. You've seen their inscriptions. You've watched their processions. But then your stylus reaches back, past your father's time, past your grandfather's time, past the founding of your city, past even the first temples at Eridu. Now you're writing about Alulim and Alalga and Uba-Tutu, rulers who lived in a world you cannot reconstruct. You have numbers 28,000, 800 years, 36,000 years, and a single dividing line. Then the flood swept over. You don't know what that world looked like. You don't know how those kings ruled, what their cities smelled like at dawn, what their music sounded like at night. You just know this. They existed, and then they didn't. You're staring at the cliff edge of memory itself. We're standing in a weird mirror of that moment. We're the ones with the satellites, the ice core data, the sea level curves that stretch into the future like ghostly coastlines. We can literally watch Greenland bleeding into the ocean from space. We can model storm surges slamming into cities that currently feel unshakable. But in the moment, it still feels abstract, so we file it under the news. Under complicated. Under later. The Sumerians didn't have that luxury. Their news was myth. Their later was the flood that had already happened. They'd heard the story since childhood of a time when kings lived like gods, when the world was ordered, when heaven and earth were closer, and of the moment it all drowned. So they built a culture around not forgetting. We've built a culture around not thinking about certain things for too long. Clay tablets and TikToks both carry information, but they're calibrated to different timescales. One is made for the hour, the other for the aeon. The Sumerians thought in centuries because they had to. The trauma they were living with wasn't a bad decade. It was the echo of a world that had ended before history began. That's what makes the figure of the last Anunnaki king so haunting. Whether he was a real person, a dynastic title, or a compressed symbol for an entire era, he marks a boundary in the human story, not just between myth and history, but between two ways of imagining power and time. Before the flood, kingship is tied to cosmic cycles, to star movements, to reign lengths that read more like orbital periods than human lives. After the flood, it's tied to city walls, irrigation projects, grain rations, and army musters. Before, kingship descends from heaven. After, it has to be redescended, rebuilt, renegotiated. The last Anunnaki king is the last ruler of a world that believed or remembered that authority was literally cosmological. We think we've outgrown that. We don't align our palaces with Orion. Our presidents don't claim descent from sky gods. Our kings, where they still exist, reign by law and constitution, not by the movements of Venus. But watch what happens every time we hit a real crisis. We start talking about forces bigger than us, about the planet responding, about nature hitting back. We slip unconsciously into mythic language, because myth was always our first attempt to describe systems beyond our control. When the rivers rise, when the storms get weird, when the summers feel wrong in a way you can't quite put into words, suddenly phrases like, "the earth is angry," stop feeling childish and start feeling like emotional shorthand for something physically real. The Sumerians put that feeling into the flood. We put it into climate reports. Same fear, different casing. And here's where the story folds back on itself. Because in a very literal way, we are now the pre-flood civilization in someone else's future myth. If sea levels do jump a meter or two over the next couple of centuries, if heat waves rearrange habitability zones, if storms consistently redraw coastlines, then the ruins of our coastal cities New York, Shanghai, Mumbai, Lagos become exactly what the Persian Gulf Basin is to us now, a drowned archive. Future archaeologists, if we leave them anything worth digging up, won't find our clouds. They'll find our concrete, our plastic, our glass. And if they also find our stories, our movies, our podcasts, our YouTube videos, maybe they'll hear the same edge of anxiety that runs under Sumerian flood myths. A sense that we knew something was coming, that we talked about it a lot, and that we still weren't sure what to do. In that way, the last Anunnaki king isn't just an ancient mystery. He's a mirror held up to our present, a reminder that before and after is not just a narrative device, it's a real thing that can happen to entire worlds. Before, ice sheets, low seas, coastal plains, hunter-gatherers who might have been more than we give them credit for. After, river valleys, city-states, ziggurats, clay tablets, scribes trying to remember. Before, fossil fuels, industrial growth, exploding population, a planet wired together. After, we don't know yet. The Sumerians didn't get to choose their flood. We may not get to choose ours, but we do get to choose how seriously we take the possibility of discontinuity while there's still time to write, to build, to remember on purpose. Somewhere, in a museum drawer, a tablet sits under soft light. On it, some tired scribe, 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, pressed a line that still hits like a punch. Then the flood swept over. We don't have a line like that yet, but we will. At some point, future historians will mark a boundary in our story too, a moment where the charts kink, where the maps change, where something ends and something else begins. We don't get to decide whether they write that line. We only get to decide what comes before it, and what, if anything, we leave behind for them to read. So maybe this is where we finally admit something simple and uncomfortable. We don't actually know if the last Anunnaki king existed the way the tablets say. We don't know if there was a single final ruler, standing on some drowned coastline, watching the horizon glow as ice sheets broke and the sky turned to fire. We don't know if kingship descended from heaven means literal sky beings, or a poetic way of saying someone showed up with knowledge the locals didn't have. What we do know is this. People who lived closer to that catastrophe than we do thought it was real enough to carve into clay. The Sumerians didn't treat the flood as metaphor. They treated it as the hard stop between one age and another. They didn't tell the story of the pre-flood kings like a bedtime myth. They logged them in the same tone they used for land sales and tax disputes. And then they put a single line between them and the world they knew. Then the flood swept over. You can almost feel the silence after that sentence. The way the stylus hesitates before pressing the next wedge. The way the scribe sits there, aware that there's a whole world he should be able to describe and can't. Just a wall of water and the faint echo of names from a time nobody remembers clearly anymore. That's what the figure of the last Anunnaki king really is. A silhouette against that wall. He's the outline of something we can't quite see. A ruler whose reign is measured in impossible numbers because the people remembering him no longer think in the time units he lived in. A bridge between divine and human whose city no one can excavate because it's under a sea no one is digging. A reminder that even the most powerful systems look immortal until the day they aren't. We love to solve mysteries. Our brains want a clean answer. Yes, there was an advanced civilization before the flood, and here is the evidence. Or, no, it's all just myth. Relax. But the truth is messier and more interesting. There probably were complex cultures living along those lost coastlines. Maybe not stargates and anti-gravity, but navigation, astronomy, sacred architecture, oral histories reaching back farther than we're comfortable with. Maybe the gods were just humans with knowledge, arriving in boats at shattered shorelines, looking to restart what they'd lost. Maybe the Anunnaki weren't aliens, but the last generation of a technical priesthood holding on to the gears of a dying world. Or maybe not. Maybe the last Anunnaki king is nothing more than the shape grief takes when you stretch it across 10,000 years. When a species survives something so huge, it can't remember the details, only the feeling that there was a before that was better and an after that's smaller. Maybe immortality in these texts is just the human way of saying that era felt endless compared to ours. Here's the thing, though, either way, the story still matters, because in the end, this isn't really a video about one mysterious king in a dusty list. It's about how we remember endings, how we talk about catastrophe, how we process the idea that everything familiar can disappear, and that someone, someday, will look back at our time and say, that was the world that ended. The Sumerians answered that fear with clay and sky. They fixed their cosmos to the movements of the stars. They embedded their calendar in the dance of the planets. They built their cities to mirror constellations and mountains. They treated kingship as a job description that included keep heaven and earth in sync. When that system broke, they kept copying the old words anyway, even after they didn't fully understand them, because they sensed those words still pointed to something important. We answer with models and measurements, and videos like this. We track patterns in CO2 and ice cores. We argue about graphs in comment sections. We watch movies about disaster and call it entertainment, even when the plot looks uncomfortably close to the news. And maybe, under all of that, we're doing the same thing they were, trying to wrap story around the feeling that the ground is moving under us again. So, what do we do with the last Anunnaki king? We don't have to turn him into dogma. We don't have to believe every claim about aliens or lost supertech to take the warning seriously. The clay tablets are already enough. They prove at least this much. Civilizations can fall so completely that for thousands of years they're reduced to a single line about a flood and a handful of names no one understands. We like to think that can't happen to us. They probably thought the same. Maybe that's the real value of spending an hour in the dark with this story. It knocks us out of the default setting where history is a straight line and we're the inevitable destination. It reminds us that the past is full of wrong turns and hard resets, that complexity doesn't guarantee survival, and that memory is fragile even when you carve it into stone. Somewhere tonight, a night guard will walk past a glass case holding a tablet from Nippur or Kish or Ur. Under the museum lights, the wedge marks will look like nothing, just little triangles in dried mud. But inside those marks is an entire philosophy of time, a trauma response, a warning. Before the flood, kingship descended from heaven. After the flood, it had to be rebuilt by hand. We're somewhere on that kind of threshold again, standing between a world that feels solid and a future that's starting to look unfamiliar. We can't stop the tides from doing what tides do, but we can decide how seriously we take the story of people who watch their own world drown. So as you close this video, maybe do one thing. Step outside if you can. Look up at the same stars the Sumerian astronomers mapped in clay, the same constellations that shone over Göbekli Tepe, over drowned river valleys, over the last Anunnaki king, whoever he was, whatever he meant. Feel how long that light has been traveling, how many worlds it's shone on that no longer exist. And then ask yourself, quietly, in that late night space where the algorithm can't distract you for a second, if someone 4,000 years from now dug up our tablets, what would they say ended here? And what would we want them to know we were trying to do before the waters rose?